I was grabbing a coffee last week when I noticed the man at the next table staring intensely at his phone, his face pale in the glow of the screen. He wasn't scrolling through news or social media. He was watching a live debt clock, those red numbers spinning so fast they were a digital blur. 38 trillion, he whispered, looking at me with genuine fear. When the bill finally comes due, we're all finished. My grandkids, your grandkids, we're all just collateral for a debt we can never pay.
Wow. He really felt it.
He did. He spoke about it like it was this moral failing, a dark cloud hanging over the nation's soul. He was convinced that somewhere, in a high-rise in Beijing or a vault in Zurich, some shadowy group of creditors was just waiting to seize the keys to the country.
Classic fear.
Totally. He even pulled out this crumpled newspaper clipping about government spending, tapping it with a trembling finger as if it were an arrest warrant. To him, the math was just simple and undeniable. If you owe money, you eventually have to pay it back or you lose everything.
A household budget metaphor?
Exactly. But then I asked him a question that just stopped him cold. I said, what if I told you that if the government actually paid back every cent tomorrow, your pension would disappear, your bank account would go to zero, and the global economy would instantly vaporize?
I can imagine the look on his face.
He looked at me like I'd just told him the earth was flat. That instinctive panic, this idea that debt is a ticking time bomb, is something almost everyone feels.
Huh?
We've been taught to view national debt like a household credit card balance that spiraled out of control.
But that's not what it is at all.
Not even close. The reality is far stranger and honestly, much more unsettling. We aren't actually running out of money. In fact, we've built a modern world where debt isn't the problem. It's the invisible scaffolding holding everything up.
Right.
From the first bonds issued in a 17th century war room to the digital trillions moving through central banks today, the system was never designed for repayment. It was designed to be a permanent, rotating loop of promises.
A loop. That's a good way to put it.
If you follow the chain of creditors long enough, you realize we aren't waiting for a bill collector who doesn't exist. We're waiting for the one thing the system can't survive: the moment we stop believing in the lie.
That narrative, the man watching the debt clock, it just perfectly captures the fundamental misunderstanding we have about the nature of sovereign debt.
Yeah.
We're so used to that personal finance metaphor.
We are. So for this deep dive, we're going to move past that.
We have to. We're going to examine the structural architecture of global credit.
Yeah.
The whole story is about how sovereign debt evolved from, a way to finance wars in the 17th century to this absolute structural necessity that holds the entire modern international order together.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have sources that take us from, Restoration England all the way up to modern financial diplomacy and the philosophy of governance. It's a huge interconnected landscape.
It is. And I think our mission today is to dive into this material and explore three core structural questions. First, how did modern sovereign debt even gain credibility in the first place?
Where did the trust come from?
Exactly. We have to dissect that shift in England from an arbitrary king to an institutional commitment. Second, what sort of structural power does this debt system enforce globally today? We'll look at the vulnerability of the global south and the kind of discipline imposed by big financial institutions.
And the third question?
The third is about the philosophical and political structures needed to sustain all this. Specifically, how the world's largest creditors maintain their own financial stability, which takes us from economics right into the deep roots of governance.
I think starting with the history of trust is essential. That fear the man in the coffee shop felt, the fear of someone just taking your wealth, that was a total economic reality for centuries. So let's start with the Stuarts in 17th century England.
This is where we learn why credibility is the foundation of absolutely everything. Before all the institutional reforms of the late 17th century, lending money to the English crown was, an incredibly high-risk proposition.
Because the king could just change his mind.
Pretty much. The sovereign was incredibly constrained. He could just change the rules, violate a contract, or decide, that a loan wasn't necessary to repay. It completely undermined any financial agreement.
And their whole financial setup was precarious to begin with. They were supposed to live on their own.
Precisely. They were meant to rely on their hereditary revenues income from crown lands, customs duties, little fees. But the crown's ambitions, especially for wars, always outstripped these revenues. It led to these chronic deficits.
Do we have numbers on that?
We do. If you look at the data from, say, 1617, there's a deficit of £36,000. It sounds small now, but that was nearly 10% of their total annual spending.
10% isn't catastrophic, but it's a structural problem, a sign that things are only going to get worse, which forced the Stuarts into actions that really destroyed their long-term ability to borrow.
Absolutely. When they needed to cover those shortfalls, they resorted to these confiscatory and arbitrary measures that just systematically undermined the private rights of their own subjects.
A classic example being the sale of ground lands.
The perfect example. Elizabeth I sold off about a quarter of her lands. James I sold another quarter. And then Charles I sold off the rest. They were sacrificing a continuous, stable stream of revenue, their underlying asset base, just to cover immediate annual shortfalls.
It's like selling off the family farm year after year just to pay the grocery bill. It signals total desperation.
It does. But even worse, arguably, were the forced loans.
Now, these weren't market transactions at all.
Not at all. They were effectively mandatory levies on wealthy subjects, often extracted under intense political pressure. We see them pop up again and again, 1604, 1617, 1625, and the repayment terms were a complete farce.
How so?
Well, the 1617 loan, which raised a pretty significant sum, was advertised as a one-year loan, but it wasn't fully repaid until 1628.
An 11-year delay.
11 years, often without full interest. It just demonstrated that the king's promise was completely worthless if it was inconvenient. It taught lenders that lending to the crown was basically the same as having your money taken.
And if the king couldn't force a loan, he'd just invent a new way to tax wealth, like through monopolies.
Exactly, granting exclusive rights to sell necessities like soap or tobacco or starch. These monopolies acted as this arbitrary, hidden tax on everyone.
But they also expropriated the value of existing investments, right?
Crucially, yes. Imagine you had invested in a profitable soap manufacturing business, and then suddenly the king grants a monopoly to one of his favorites. Your entire investment is instantly worthless. So why would any merchant invest for the future? The fundamental rules could just be changed overnight by a royal decree.
And if you dared to protest any of this, if you were politically opposed to the king's fiscal policy,
then they'd use arbitrary measures to silence you. The Stuarts routinely violated political liberties, jailing opponents without trial, demanding excessive bail, using tools like the Star Chamber to crush dissent.
And this was all tied to the financial instability.
It was a vicious cycle. These actions raised the cost of opposition to the crown's aggressive fundraising tactics. Arbitrary political power and financial instability just fed each other, ensuring the crown could never, ever establish reliable, long-term credit.
So when the Glorious Revolution happens in 1688, we see this radical shift. It wasn't just about who was on the throne. It was a full-blown financial revolution, wasn't it? Driven by the people with the money merchants, landowners, who demanded a system to protect their wealth.
They needed a credible commitment. The reformers of 1688 understood that the problem wasn't the debt itself. It was the lack of any institutional constraint on the borrower. So they deliberately focused on institutional changes to secure property rights and guarantee financial commitments.
The first, and maybe the most important, was parliamentary supremacy.
Absolutely. Sovereignty shifted definitively to the king and parliament. This meant the crown could no longer unilaterally alter taxes or loan terms or any major financial agreement.
So creditors now had a voice.
They had a veto point. Parliament had to assent to any change. This gave the financial class an essential check on the royal purse, effectively binding the king's hands in a way the Stuarts had always refused.
And at the same time, they built up the legal system to enforce those contracts, even against the state itself.
That was the second major pillar, the separation of powers and independent judiciary. Those old bodies used for arbitrary enforcement, like the Star Chamber, had been abolished. This assured that the common law courts now had unquestioned authority over all big areas of economic activity.
So if the government tried to default, a creditor could actually take them to court.
And have confidence in that court being politically independent from the crown. This was the real revolution. The government was now bonded to its own word through the law.
This political and legal framework then made all the fiscal innovations of the financial revolution possible.
Yes. This is where the really pragmatic changes started, a lot of them inspired by Dutch financial practices that came over with William III. Instead of just taking out vague loans, the government began the systematic practice of earmarking new taxes.
So a specific tax for a specific loan?
Exactly. A tax was earmarked specifically to pay the interest on a new long-term debt. This was crucial. It meant the king couldn't just raid the money meant for bondholders. The revenue stream was pre-assigned by Parliament, limiting the executive's discretion.
And this leads directly to the creation of the institutional linchpin, the Bank of England, in 1694.
An institutional innovation that changed everything. Lenders who subscribed to a new £1 million loan were invited to incorporate themselves as the Bank of England. The bank then handled all the government's loan accounts, making sure the promised payments went out on time.
But the most important element, the real guarantee, was the restriction placed on it, right?
The one that gave creditors genuine peace of mind, yes. The Bank of England was explicitly forbidden from lending money directly to the Crown or purchasing Crown lands without explicit consent from Parliament.
So it was a market guarantee that the king couldn't raid the national piggy bank. The bank's institutional insulation was the real assurance of credibility.
That's it, exactly. It gave creditors confidence that their money was legally walled off from arbitrary political games. The bank, as a powerful private entity whose own success depended on the government honoring its debts, became this indispensable vested interest actively monitoring the Crown's fiscal behavior.
And the market reaction was just explosive. It really proves that wealth holders weren't against debt, they were just against risk. Once that risk disappeared, borrowing just soared.
The speed of the change is astonishing. Total government debt jumped from about £1 million in 1688 to nearly £17 million by 1697.
A 17-fold increase in less than a decade.
It's massive. This debt level reached about 40% of gross national product, a figure that would have been financially impossible under the Stuarts. The state was suddenly able to finance huge wars against France simply because it had established reliable credit.
But the real indicator of trust wasn't just the volume of debt, it was the cost, the interest rate. That plummet is an incredible demonstration of this newfound credibility.
It truly is. Initial long-term loans in the early 1690s were at these crushing interest rates, 14% or even higher. It reflected immense perceived risk.
But by the end of the decade?
Once the bank and the parliamentary system were set up, those rates fell dramatically to between 6 and 8%. And by the 1730s, stable government debt could be financed for just 3%. That decline signaled that the market now saw English sovereign debt as one of the safest investments in the world. It's the real-world impact of simply proving you'll stick to your word.
And that stable public debt, this new reliable financial instrument, then had these massive positive externalities for the whole economy.
Absolutely. The government's need for stable, predictable borrowing created the bedrock for the development of modern private capital markets. London banks flourished because they had a reliable, low-risk asset government bonds to use as collateral and for liquidity.
So private trading took off.
It boomed. The volume of short-dated securities traded jumped from around £300,000 a year in the early 1690s to £3.4 million a year just a decade later. This period really catalyzed the development of financial services and set England on the path to becoming the dominant financial power for the next 2 centuries.
Before we move on, we have to touch on the practical problem of money itself. The chronic shortage of currency and the literal destruction of the coins.
The currency crisis, yeah. This was a fundamental issue that had to be solved for the financial revolution to really take hold. Because of trade deficits, England was constantly losing gold and silver bullion abroad to settle payments.
And domestically, people were clipping the coins.
Right, they were shaving up to 40% of the precious metal content off the edges of silver coins. This just eroded all confidence in the money and slowed commerce down to a crawl.
So William III, again drawing on Dutch experience, had to solve this liquidity problem at the same time he was setting up the new debt system.
He used a necessary but pretty disruptive dual approach. First, the Great Recoinage. They called in all the clipped silver and minted new coins, but crucially, they mixed the silver with cheaper alloys.
So it kept the weight but reduced the intrinsic value.
Exactly, and the philosophical shift here was profound. The value of the coin was no longer tied to its weight in metal, but to the state's stamp. It signaled that the state, now credibly constrained by Parliament, was the ultimate guarantor of monetary value.
And the second part was paper money.
The push for paper money issuance by the Bank of England. It provided the necessary liquidity. The bank's notes, backed by this new institutional credibility, quickly gained public acceptance, stabilizing the economy and ensuring the success of the new debt-based financial system.
So, to sum up that first part, it was all about building credibility. Institutions, not just powerful people, had to guarantee the debt. The English spent a century creating constraints on their own state. The irony today is that those institutions, now global, are what constrain other states.
That's the perfect pivot. We move from the historical struggle to establish a borrower's credibility to the modern reality where immense financial actor concentration dictates global terms. We're now examining the dynamic of power enforced by the contemporary debt scaffolding.
The sources refer to the structural power of finance. That sounds much more pervasive and less negotiable than traditional state power.
It is. This power stems from the increasing reliance of states on private, commercial credit, and the massive concentration of wealth and decision-making among just a few large financial actors.
We've seen steep concentration in banking.
For sure. The market share held by the world's top 5 banks, for example, ballooned from 17% in 1970 to a staggering 52% by 2020 in certain sectors. This centralization means fewer hands control the flow of global capital. If those few entities decide you're a risk, capital just dries up instantly.
And the very nature of sovereign debt has changed, shifting the power in any negotiation.
Absolutely. Historically, debt relief or restructuring was often negotiated among states, the official bilateral creditors, the Paris Club. But now, sovereign debt has dramatically shifted to commercial creditors. Banks, hedge funds, private investors holding bonds.
And the impact of that is huge.
It's massive. By 2021, low and middle income countries owed commercial creditors 5 times more than they owed bilateral creditors.
That commercial debt creates a systemic vulnerability, doesn't it? It lacks the cooperation mechanisms that state-to-state loans often had.
It generates immense systemic risk. Private debt is characterized by specific dangers, high and often variable interest rates that can swing with global monetary policy.
And it's usually denominated in a foreign currency, like US dollars.
Usually dollars, yeah. Which means the borrowing country is totally vulnerable to exchange rate shifts. And critically, there's no cohesive mechanism to force private lenders into cooperating on a restructuring. If a nation defaults, you have to negotiate with hundreds of individual bondholders. Getting them all to agree to a haircut is nearly impossible.
Which leads to these protracted legal battles that just further cripple the debtor nation.
Exactly. And this confluence of the pandemic, global inflation, and rising interest rates has led to the worst debt crisis in the global South in decades.
A true perfect storm.
It is. The pandemic required massive emergency spending. Then you had global conflict that spiked food and fuel prices, causing high inflation. At the same time, major central banks tightened monetary policy to fight their own inflation, meaning global interest rates soared. This just exponentially multiplied the debt burdens for developing nations.
So where does that leave them now?
Total developing world debt is at a 50-year high. By 2022, sources were projecting that up to a dozen developing economies could face an imminent inability to service their debt.
And this structural power is exerted constantly, not just in a crisis, through what the sources call the austerity ethos.
The austerity ethos is the mechanism of discipline. It's this internalized compulsion. Political leaders are perpetually bound by the need to maintain business confidence.
Which means they have to adopt fiscal austerity, right? Restraining public spending, promoting privatization.
Even when they are not in immediate default, they do it just to signal to global financial markets that they are macroprudential, stable, and safe to invest in.
It sounds like the state willingly restricts its own ability to govern, prioritizing creditor interests over its own citizens.
That's the consequence. The growing dependence on private capital markets weakens the state's autonomy. The government fears that if key market indicators trend negatively, even slightly, capital will flee overnight, and their borrowing costs will skyrocket, plunging them into crisis. The message is that good standing requires the internalization of debtor discipline.
So, when a country eventually hits that wall, the IMF steps in as the so-called lender of last resort. But this role, the sources argue, is highly controversial.
The IMF's function has fundamentally shifted. It was originally intended for global monetary coordination, but since the late 1970s, it's basically become a fiscal disciplinarian. Its structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, enforced in exchange for emergency financing, reveal a deeply tilted balance of power.
And what are the effects of those SAPs on the ground?
Well, the policies often mandate the dismantling of state subsidies, the erosion of social spending on things like healthcare and education, and policies that restrain wealth redistribution. They enforce rapid privatization. The central goal is almost always to generate enough hard currency to service external debt.
To prevent a default and protect the creditors.
Exactly. The key critique is that the IMF's role essentially protects large commercial banks and investors from the negative consequences of their own risky, imprudent lending decisions.
So the risk gets transferred?
The risk is transferred from the bank's balance sheet to the social services and economic stability of the debtor nation. It reinforces this structural power of finance, where developing nations have little choice but to issue high-risk bonds and constantly signal market confidence, often by sacrificing their own domestic priorities.
Okay, so we've seen how institutional credibility was built in the 17th century and how that system evolved into one that enforces structural power globally today. Now, let's pivot to the third dimension, The stability maintained by a primary global creditor, China, and the architecture of its strategic reserve management.
China's financial presence is immense and, strategically unique. They manage the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, the FX reserves. We're talking around $3.2 trillion by 2025.
That scale is enormous.
It's more than double the holdings of Japan, the next largest. And this isn't just static wealth. It's an active tool of both domestic and international stability.
So how does Beijing use this massive war chest domestically? What's the core function of the reserves?
Domestically, they operate as a giant national savings account and a primary tool for currency management. They are essential for currency stabilization. Since the yuan isn't fully floating, the People's Bank of China uses its massive dollar holdings to smooth out fluctuations in the renminbi.
How does that work in practice?
So if the renminbi starts to climb too fast, which could hurt China's export competitiveness, the PBOC can sell a large chunk of those US dollars on the open market. This increases the supply of dollars, weakening the renminbi's value relative to the dollar. And they can do the reverse if the currency falls too fast.
So they also function as a massive insurance policy against global shocks.
Precisely. They serve as a critical economic buffer, providing immense liquidity to protect the domestic economy from financial volatility, whether that's a global recession, a trade shock, or potential capital flight. Just knowing those reserves exist gives everyone confidence in China's ability to weather almost any storm.
Given the reliance on dollar assets, this massive holding inevitably becomes a geopolitical tool, not just an economic one.
That is the strategic intent. Beijing leverages this financial capacity as a form of powerful soft power. These reserves underpin and support massive international initiatives, most notably the Belt and Road projects.
So they can offer alternatives to Western institutions.
Right. They use currency swap lines and trade arrangements to provide financial stability, investment, and infrastructure funding to partner countries. It enhances global influence without relying on the World Bank or the IMF.
The sources indicate a large portion is still in U.S. Treasury bonds for safety, but Beijing is clearly trying to reduce that over-reliance on U.S. policy, isn't it?
That's a key strategic goal: diversification and hedging. While U.S. dollar assets are essential, Beijing is actively diversifying its reserves by accumulating gold and other currencies. This supports the broader long-term ambition of internationalizing the yuan.
By getting other countries to use it and hold it.
Exactly. By promoting the yuan's use in cross-border trade and encouraging its inclusion in other nations' reserve holdings, China is gradually reducing its vulnerability to U.S. economic policy decisions or potential sanctions.
And China's position allows it to influence global markets not just through its reserves, but through its ability to act as a stabilizing force during regional crises.
That is the functional utility of being a dominant creditor. China's reserves enable it to selectively intervene in markets or provide liquidity to stabilize regions during crises. This indirectly influences global financial markets, shapes trade dynamics, and gives Beijing considerable flexibility in negotiating loans and partnerships. It's a very sophisticated form of economic diplomacy.
Beyond the financial architecture, China also puts forward a philosophical vision for how global governance should operate, especially for the developing world. This is captured in the Global Governance Initiative, the GGI.
The GGI is China's proposal for the reform of the existing international system. The goal isn't revolutionary change, but rather a set of principles aimed at making existing institutions, especially the UN, more effective, more coordinated, and much more responsive to the interests of developing countries who often feel marginalized by the current financial order.
Let's break down the core principles of the GGI, starting with sovereign equality and the international rule of law.
Sovereign equality is paramount here. It means that all countries, regardless of size, wealth, or power, are equal participants and decision-makers in global affairs.
So a country like Zambia should have as much say in its debt relief as its creditors.
In principle, yes. The idea is to push for greater representativeness, moving away from a system where a few powerful countries dominate institutions like the IMF. On the rule of law, the GGI emphasizes applying international law equally, without the double standards that are often perceived when great powers interact with smaller nations.
And the commitment to multilateralism.
Multilateralism strongly supports the United Nations as the core platform for addressing global issues. The GGI proposes strengthening the UN's role and ensuring global challenges are solved through joint contribution and consultation, moving away from unilateral actions or policies dictated by a single power bloc. The focus is on a people-centered approach, making sure governance priorities are focused on improving people's livelihoods, not just on geopolitical maneuvering.
We've established that managing this immense financial power requires deep domestic stability. This brings us to the final piece of the debt scaffolding, the philosophical and political requirement for that stability, which in China's case is linked to the long tradition of meritocracy.
Right. If the 17th century revolution required institutional commitment, a modern global power requires a robust, legitimate domestic system to manage trillions in financial might. China's long-term stability and economic success are often tied back to this deep cultural and political tradition of meritocracy.
And this tradition is ancient, going back over 2 millennia.
It's one of the longest continuous traditions in governance. Meritocracy was institutionalized in China during the Han Dynasty over 2,000 years ago, where officials were theoretically selected based on virtue and capability.
Then codified by the civil examination system.
Exactly. The Tang Dynasty system codified this, creating a path for high social mobility based on learning and competence, which was a stark contrast to the hereditary feudal systems you saw elsewhere at the time. This cultural bedrock honors the learned and the capable.
And how is this translated into the modern Chinese governance structure today?
Well, the ruling party has inherited and adapted this tradition. They've established highly structured rules to select and promote officials, with a real emphasis on measurable ability and virtue. This focus on measured capability is critical.
And there's research to back this up.
There is. Empirical research confirms this meritocratic mechanism works. Studies comparing government officials found that the most capable mayor, based on objective performance indicators, is 30% more likely to be promoted to a provincial-level office than the least capable. Performance drives advancement.
We often hear about the anti-corruption campaigns. From the perspective of this meritocratic system, are they just about punishing wrongdoing, or are they a structural mechanism to maintain quality and legitimacy?
They're presented as a measure to purify the party and, critically, strengthen the legitimacy of the bureaucracy. The anti-corruption campaign focuses deeply on enforcing discipline, making sure officials adhere to conduct rules like the 8 rules, and educating them.
So it's about quality control.
You can see it that way. It's viewed as strengthening the quality and integrity of the bureaucracy. Corruption, in this view, is a failure of meritocracy, its competence being subverted by self-interest. And it has to be rooted out to sustain the system's legitimacy in the eyes of the public.
The sources suggest that this commitment to a strong meritocratic bureaucracy helped facilitate China's famously smooth economic transition from a planned to a market economy.
That is a key observation. Compared to the often chaotic transitions we saw in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union, China's shift was much more orderly. This was partly because the market rewards hard work and effort, which naturally aligns with that deep-seated cultural value of merit.
And entrepreneurship is widely respected.
It is, because it's seen as a tangible display of merit and capability.
And what about the necessity of maintaining a strong state within this highly dynamic economic system?
The strong, meritocratic state is viewed as essential for 2 reasons. First, stability. It ensures massive, rapid economic change doesn't descend into social chaos. Second, and crucially, it's seen as necessary to prevent the government from being captured by strong business interests, where a few powerful companies dictate policy. Right. And that's seen as an obstacle to inclusive growth worldwide. The state's capacity to control capitalistic excess, like unwarranted monopolies and systemic corruption, ensures that business access and opportunities remain open and fair for all capable individuals, thereby strengthening the meritocratic ethos.
This directly contrasts with critiques we often hear in the West, like the idea of the tyranny of meritocracy, where intense competition leads to a deeply divided society of stressed-out winners and alienated losers.
In Western discourse, meritocracy is sometimes linked to deep societal division and a lack of safety nets. In the Chinese context, while competition is fierce, the long tradition emphasizes that the government's role is to ensure stability and the public good.
So the state manages the side effects of capitalism.
It actively does. For example, the massive targeted poverty alleviation campaigns, which achieved the UN 2030 poverty goal a decade early, are seen as the necessary counterbalance to capitalistic excesses. The state maintains control over the trajectory of development to ensure the pursuit of individual merit ultimately serves the collective good and prevents that rigid, divided society critics fear. Stability and capability are seen as mutually reinforcing.
This has been a truly global deep dive, all centered on this single concept of sovereign debt.
We have. We've analyzed the global financial structure across three critical dimensions. First, the historical struggle to establish credibility. When 17th century England fundamentally reshaped its governance to create public debt backed by the Bank of England and a secured currency. This proved that predictable institutions are essential to lowering the cost of money.
Second, we examined the modern dynamics of power enforced by the current financial architecture, how the concentration of private finance demands austerity and discipline, often prioritizing creditor balance sheets over the social needs of nations in the global south.
And finally, we explored the philosophical underpinnings of stability, looking at China's sophisticated strategic reserve management and its reliance on a deep-rooted tradition of meritocracy and a strong, disciplined state to sustain its financial might, manage economic transitions, and project soft power globally.
It all comes back to that man watching the debt clock and his fear of the bill coming due. But the fundamental insight remains the same, doesn't it? Whether we're analyzing 17th century bonds or multi-trillion-dollar reserves.
Indeed. The global economy is a vast structure of interlocking financial promises, a scaffolding upheld not by wealth itself, but by the relentless shared belief in the integrity and predictability of the institutions, whether it be the 1688 Parliament, the Bank of England, or the modern central bank managing trillions, that create and enforce those promises. This constant necessity for institutional commitment, the continuous maintenance of that shared belief, is the true, non-negotiable cost of the world's debt scaffolding.